Kiddushin Daf Yomi Kiddushin, bridging social barriers. מצוות יעוד, עבריה. Let's learn some amazing Gemara. Tragic reality of poverty. It's a reality. There is such a thing in life, and it creates classes and barriers that can last for generations and generations that it's very hard to climb out of. America was like the first modern society where you could relatively easily move from one class to another. Many will argue that even there it's often almost impossible to do so, and most people can't do so. But the Torah introduces an amazing mechanism, to some degree at least, to help people out of this class rut that one can get locked into. You can learn the Torah through a Western liberal secular lens, and there are parts of the Torah you will find disgusting. You can take that same piece of Torah and learn it through the lens of Chazal, the way it's been passed down to us in our oral tradition from generation to generation, and that same piece of Torah, which would be disgusting to one person, becomes a source of inspiration and elevation to another person. And the sugya, the whole piece of an Ivriya, is one such thing. The fact that in times of poverty, a father is permitted to sell his daughter into slavery, into servitude, as a shifcha, as an Ivriya, as a Jewish servant. And what that means, these few daf that we have now deal with that idea of an Amma Ivriya, with a particular twist in that halacha, which is the mitzvah of Ya'ud. That means the man who buys the rights to this Amma Ivriya, who has to be a young girl, she's not yet bat mitzvah when this transaction takes place. The man who acquires the rights to this Amma has a mitzvah. Not just is he permitted, he actually has a mitzvah to marry her. So what does that all mean? What is this all about, and how do we understand this piece of Torah? So let's start with the psuki. In Parshas Mishpatim, B'chim kol ishit bitol la'ama. If a man sells his daughter as an amma, as a servant, lo tetzei ketzei ta'avadim, her laws of getting out of the contract are different from those of an eved. Im ra'a b'nei adonai asher lo ya'ada v'hefda, if she does not appeal to her master, and therefore he does not assign her to himself as a wife, you can't sell her to a non-Jew or to anybody else. You can't trade in her. Bevigdor, we're going to talk about that word bevigdor, but literally it seems to mean having abandoned her. Is it the father who abandoned her? Is the master who doesn't marry her who's abandoned her? If he doesn't want to marry her, he can marry her to his son. In which case the marriage is a normal marriage and she's entitled to every right of a Jewish wife. If he marries a second wife, he cannot in any way diminish the rights to this wife, to the Amma, the young servant who became his wife. She gets all the rights of a wife. And if he doesn't marry her himself, and he doesn't marry her to his son, she can go out when she reaches an age of maturity. She leaves the servitude without any kind of payment or anything. Importance in the Rambam, Ein ha'av rashai limkor et bito ela im kein hei ani v'lo nish'ar lo klum. A person is only allowed to sell his daughter into servitude if he has become so poor that he has nothing. Lo karka, no property. Lo metaltali, no movable property. Va'afilu ksucha alav. He doesn't even have the rights to a piece of clothing for himself. He's wearing borrowed clothing. He doesn't even have it. Only such poverty allows this way out, to take his daughter and sell her labor to a master. And even then, says the Rambam, as soon as it is possible, the community helps, whatever, the father has to try and get her out of that servitude and buy her out. He cannot marry her without her participation, without her willingness. It's not something which is forced, which she doesn't have to marry him. He has to offer to marry her. If she doesn't want to marry her, then so be it. Very important piece of Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch is the book of mitzvahs written by one of the Rishonim, we're not sure who. The Sefer HaChinuch says there's a mitzvah leya'ed Amma ha'ivriya, for the master to marry her, and this mitzvah is more important than the mitzvah of redeeming her. It's a greater mitzvah to marry her than to let her go. Mishal shem mitzvah zu. The understanding of this mitzvah, says the Sefer HaChinuch, Sherichem hakel al ha'aniya animkeret v'al aviyah. The Torah has sympathy, empathy for the young girl who has been sold and for the father. Just think of the hellhole in which she would be raised. Her father has nothing, not even clothing for himself, never mind for his daughter. and you're in a society, how's she ever going to get out of that? She's never going to get an education. What kind of shidduch will she ever get? What kind of life is she destined for in that situation? So the Torah creates this way out. The Torah instructs the man who buys it, and now it's not just a handout. This is a man of pride. He doesn't want charity from the community. So he sells his daughter's labor, and the man who buys that labor immediately offers to marry her and to turn her into a geveret, into a mistress in the house, not a servant in the house. So now she's out of the poverty. She's now married a wealthy man. The father's got money. It's not, because you might say, well, if he wants to marry her, why doesn't he just offer to marry her? Why go through the amah? Why go through the servitude? Because the servitude enables somebody to pay the father, not charity, but for something of value. So he goes to the father, he says, you've got a wonderful daughter. I need some help in the house. I will pay you $10,000 to have the help in the house until she grows up. So now he's out of his poverty. What about her? The next day he says to her, I want to marry you. Well, I would like you to marry my son. Now she's right out of the social, she's into another class. She's now the wife of a wealthy man. All through this unbelievable mitzvah. God is merciful. She should marry you to the son, if not to him. She could have a good life with the son as well. And if that doesn't work, he must help her gain her freedom, but get her out of the hellhole of poverty. So the father got money because he bought her. Now he helps her buy her own freedom. She gets out with freedom. She's no longer assigned to that home of poverty, and there's a way out of this terrible destitution. This is all part of Hashem's chesed. So when you look at this through the lens of the Torah, giving us a mechanism to save this girl from the hellhole of destitution. Says the Rambam, if the master now said he marries her, basically, she now becomes an arusa. She's betrothed. It's not yet a marriage. He still has to do a chuppah. So the ya'ud, the way that ya'ud works is he doesn't have to do a ceremony for ya'ud. He just says, you are mine, whatever he wants to say. He doesn't even have to give her a ring, because he uses the money with which he acquired her in the first place. So there's already been a transfer of assets. That transfer of assets is enough to make her his wife, if he so chooses, and she agrees. But now she's an arusa. They're betrothed. Now they have to have a chuppah. He has a proper chuppah, and he invites the community, and they have a reception, and sheva brachos, and they have a whole do for the chuppah. Until then, she's an arusa. But from that moment, now she can't become free through the mechanisms reserved for a slave. The only way she can become free now is with a get, or with the death of a husband. She has the laws of a wife. And he's got to relate to her as a wife and not as a maidservant. If a marriage takes place, if there is an erusin, then she changes her status, and he must change the way he relates to her. Says the Rambam, we see that that's quoted almost verbatim from the Gemara on the next daf, as we'll see tomorrow. There is an astonishing Netziv. Remember, the Netziv was the Rosh Yeshiva of Elozhin for the whole of the 19th century. His life spanned the 19th century, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva for 40 years, second half of the 19th century. And he was the Rebbe of a whole generation of Rosh Yeshivas, whose Torah we still get today. And the Netziv says in Hamek Davar, he wrote the wonderful parish on the Torah, and he says in Parshas Mishpatim, an astonishing thing, which I haven't seen people comment about, but it's so astonishing because it goes against the Rambam and against the Gemara. And he says, clearly, when a man buys the rights to this young servant, his intention is to marry her. That's what's going on here. This is a way to marry the girl, but get money to the father, and it's a way to take him and her out of poverty. But his idea is, she'll grow up and I will marry her. Now listen to what the Netziv says. And after he's married her, even though she's has the category of Amah, this is not quite the same as another wife. Our Gemara says she's a wife after that. Says the Netziv, well, not quite. Because the Torah doesn't give the wife a job to do in the house. The Chachomim, the rabbis, gave certain jobs, certain rights that the man has for his wife to do certain jobs in the house. But the Torah doesn't give her any jobs to do. She doesn't have those obligations. But this girl, Min HaTorah, does have a job. Even after Yehud, he's now married her. He's done a rusin, and he's done the chuppah, and they've had a reception. And now she goes home, and we talked about the transformation that happens when a pnuya becomes an eshet ish, when a woman, an unmarried woman becomes a married woman, her personality changes, everything changes in the security of a new situation and a new status. So she also comes, there's a reception, she comes home now as his wife. But one thing remains is the Netziv. She still has the obligations, the job doesn't change. Her status changes, but not her job. Where does he get that from? All the changes is the security that he can't get rid of her except with a get. So she has the security and permanence of a wife, but she has the job of a shifchat. I haven't seen anybody else who says this, and it seems to be against the Rambam, who says he's got to treat her as a wife and not as a maidservant. Where does the Netziv get it from? That the job continues. It's as a wife. She's a wife in as much as there's security, and they have a relationship of husband and wife in every other way. But the job remains the same. Where does that come from? I think it comes from our Gemara. This is where we get into our piece of Gemara and Daf Yomi Kiddushin, where Omar Mar, the Gemara talks about the fact there are certain things about a slave that don't apply to a maidservant. And the Gemara says, but we see Yavria from the Mishnah, it seems that everything that applies to the slave does apply to the maidservant. We won't go into that now. But what the Gemara comes to the conclusion is, no, where she has a situation different from a slave is where Yehud has taken place. So he's now married her. Ask him, if he's married her, then of course she can't get her freedom with all the ways that a slave can. She's now a wife. The only way she can get freedom is if he died or if he gives her a get. We know that. We don't need that to be told. Get her by her. She needs a get. Says the Gemara an amazing thing. I might have thought, yes, Yehud has taken place and she's now his wife, but I might have thought that the halachot that she had as an amah haven't moved away, haven't been cancelled. Kamash Malan, it comes to teach us they have been cancelled. The Rambam learns that means everything has been cancelled. She's no longer an Amah, she is now an Isha in every way. And Netziv learns, and we'll see why, no, we're only talking here about her methods of gaining freedom. She gains freedom the way a wife does, no longer the way a servant does. There has to be a get. Without a get, she doesn't gain freedom. And Rashi says on this Hilchata, Hilchot Amah Ivriya. I might have thought that the halachot of the servant still apply, and therefore the imratzta latzet be'echad me'elu below get tetzeh. If she wants her freedom using one of the other mechanisms that are available to a slave, a servant, she can use them. Kamash malan, it comes to teach us, no, she can't. Her only way out is with a get. Now that word hilchot ha'amah ivriya. So I want to reference you to understand the source of this amazing Netziv. Let's go back to the Gemara on Daf Tezayin and that when we learned the Ramban. And the Ramban said there are two different kinyanim, there are two different connections to an Eved, in this case of Avdut. The one was a kinyan kesef, which is the kinyan that requires the servant to work for you. And the other one is a kinyan haguf, where there is a change in status. The Eved is no longer the same status. And we saw it with an Eved Knani, and now it applies also to an Eved Ivri. An Eved Knani has to do certain mitzvot. Even an Eved Ivri is permitted to a shikha. There are certain status laws that change when you make somebody an Eved. And the Ramban said you can forego your rights to the job, but you can't forego the status change. For that you need a get shiur. You actually need a get that releases them. So the Ramban created this difference, these two elements, these two dimensions of Avdut. When a man becomes an Eved, or in this case a woman becomes a shifcha, two things happen. She has contracted her labor and her status has changed from a free person to a shifcha. What happens with Yehud? With Yehud, I would suggest, according to the Ramban, and that's the way that Netziv is learning, with Yehud her status changes. but the job hasn't changed. He bought her rights to labor, that remains. Unless he's moichel, he's allowed to say, I don't need that anymore. But until he says that, her job as a help in the house continues. Mida oraita, even after Yiyud, and that would be where the Netziv gets this from. This change in status that takes place with Yiyud, we have an interesting phrase in the Gemara that talks about Kivan shepiresh talito aleha. The bottom of the Chet and the Aleph, the top of Amud Bet. Once he has spread his talis over her. That's the phrase that is used for Yiyud. Says the Rashash. The Rashash was in Vilna the same period as the Netziv was in Volozhin. Says the Rashash, this is where the veiling of a bride comes from. This idea that he spreads his talis over her, this is the idea of the veil. There's a minhag of bedecking in some communities, where the chosin goes to do the bedecking himself, to cover her. That's part of it. I will cover you with my talis, although it's her veil. It's good that he should actually do the bedecking, says the Rashash. This is the makor for it. This is where it comes from, our piece of Gemara. In Root, we see the same wording. But I think this only happened with Yiyud. This wasn't at every marriage. The only time they did this bedecking was with Yiyud. Until now she had the status of a servant. So he shows her a gesture of public intimacy, putting his garment around her and embracing her in it, to say from now on we are husband and wife, you're not a servant. They cover themselves with one garment like an ish and an isha. So this goes further. This goes to the minhag that you see sometimes under the chuppah, where they take a talis and the chosin wraps it around the talis. But that's based on amaratzut. That's completely moved. Because for the Sfardim there's a basis for that, because they don't do a bedecking, and they do that instead of the bedecking. But for Ashkenazim, what does it say? According to the Rashash, when you wrap the talis around your bride, what are you saying? You're no longer my servant. You're now my wife, but don't forget, we learned in the Netziv, you still have all the laws of servant. You're still working for me. It's so interesting that a lot of the women who are into feminism like this idea of doing the talis. And I call that cultural appropriation, because we get mixed up with minhagim. For a Sfardi to do it is right according to their set of minhagim. But in Ashkenazi, who has a different set of minhagim, to appropriate selected minhagim from Sfardim. And we do it all the time. We do it in shuls, we do it in davening, we do it at our weddings, we do it at our simchas. We appropriate minhagim and we create a shatnez. We mix minhagim that don't belong together. So here, for an Ashkenazi to do that would be saying, this is Yiyud, says the Rasha. That would be saying, you weren't my fiancé before, you were my maidservant before. Now you're going to be my maidservant and my wife. That's what it means when you put the talis around it. So why do it? It just shows that you don't understand the Gemara, that you've never learned the Sugya, that you've never learned the Rashash, that you don't understand the meaning of it, and that the minhag is shallow. And so we should discourage it if possible. That's not for Ashkenazim to do. People think it looks cute, it's romantic, but understand minhagim and practices have sources in Torah. They're not just things you pick up in the street. You don't just see something nice. Like the minhag, they start now exchanging rings, and the girl gives the man a ring. Isn't that nice? They do it in the secular law. Isn't that romantic? No, it's not romantic. It undoes the wedding. It makes the Kiddushin batil, unless you do it afterwards and it's clearly not part of the wedding. But if at the time of giving the ring, they exchange rings, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, that undoes, we learned that. That undoes the whole wedding. You can't use amaratzut, you can't use ignorance when it comes to minhagim. You can't just adopt minhagim from the street, and you can't appropriate minhagim from other cultures. You've got to make sure that there's consistency, that everything that you're doing makes sense. Otherwise, it's like one Rosh Hashiva said, it's like wearing a bow tie with your pajamas. Pajamas are fine, and the tuxedo is fine. You want to, but to wear a bow tie with your pajamas doesn't work. And we do that all the time as we incorporate minhagim that don't belong to our culture. They're great minhagim in the right set. If you're going to sleep, it's a great minhag to wear pajamas. If you're going to a party, it's a great minhag to wear a bow tie. But to wear bow tie and pajamas, that's shatnez. That doesn't make any sense. And we do that often. We introduce minhagim that don't make sense, and this is a great example of where we tend to do that.